Thank you for the reminder there. All right, so we're now recording, so everything we say now is official. So again, I'm going to go a little bit over the journal, talk a little bit about the process in which manuscripts are submitted and evaluated, and then the thing I think a lot of people are here for, I'm going to give some tips on how to be a little bit more successful in trying to get stuff published in TRSE. And then we'll end with an invitation for people who want to become reviewers for TRSE and talk about what makes a good review. There are also a couple of editorial board members here, Annalise Halverson and Kevin Maywesson, and I've invited them to jump in anytime they feel the need. So I'm going to share my screen, but I'll keep the chat open. And so if you have questions, I'm fine if you unmute your microphone and just ask, or you can type them in the chat and we can go from there. All right. So I am Wayne Jordan. I'm the editor of TRSE, and I've been doing this now. I guess I'm going on, this will be my 6th year heading as editor coming up. And before that, I was an associate editor for TRSE. So I've gotten to know the journal pretty well. So if this is your first kind of interaction with the journal, just a couple, facts about the journal. It's the official journal of CUFA, which is why we're here, and they're holding this as part of the pre-conference stuff. We have a ton of great journals in the field of social studies education, but TRSE tends to be considered the premier research journal in the field. And that'll become important in a minute when we talk about what kind of manuscripts get published in TRSE. TRSE has an international scope, largely due to the fact that it's published by Taylor and Francis. At one point in the journal's history, it was basically read by CUFA members, and which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. But now that when people get their articles published in TRSE, it's going out to all around the world. So that's exciting for our authors. A couple things that we really pride ourselves with TRSE is that you'll get a decision back within 3 months. And if you've ever submitted to a journal, sometimes that can take 6 months up to a year. And when you're on the tenure track, that's way too long. And so we're very cognizant of getting decisions back to authors quickly. So usually we're averaging about 2 months, but you'll definitely get a decision within 3 months. And then if your manuscript is accepted, we make every effort to make sure that they get published in a print version of the journal within 1 year. But what's even better is that we have something called rapid publishing, which a lot of journals have these days. So when something gets accepted, it gets onto the TRSE website within a matter of weeks. So how hard is it to get into TRSE? Well, our acceptance rate is approximately 10%. So we're pretty exclusive. So we'll talk more about what that means here in a minute. But don't let that number scare you, because a lot of things that get submitted to the journal aren't even within the main scope of TRSE, so they get desk rejected, and so that all gets calculated into the acceptance rate. So that's just something to keep in mind. So don't get scared with the 10% acceptance rate. And we use a blind review process, which we'll talk more about in a second. And one of the things that authors, I think, really like about TRSE is we give them room to work. A lot of journals will say that you have to get your point across in 5,000 words, including references, and that's really hard to do. We allow authors to have 10,000 words, and that does not count the abstract, the references, any endnotes or tables or figures. So especially for those of you who do qualitative research, you know that it takes a lot of space sometimes, a lot of words to get your point across and show your data. So TRSE is a great venue for those of you who want to have space to really flesh out an idea. All right, so when you submit something to TRSE, these are the main steps here. So you submit it through Manuscript Central, and then it gets funneled to me. So I'm the first person to read it. So I read everything that comes in, and I have to make a decision about whether the manuscript should be sent out for review. And so sometimes I get people asking, well, why don't you just send everything out for review? Well, if you've ever been a reviewer for a journal, it takes up a lot of time. And so I want to make sure that I'm not wasting my external reviewers' time. So if I see a manuscript that's definitely not a good fit, or I see a manuscript that has a fundamentally fatal flaw that will never get published in TRSE, I desk reject at that point. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. If you make it past me, that's always a good sign. That means your manuscript, you sent it to the right place. and it's pretty good. And so at that point, I send it out to external reviewers. We always send it out to 3 folks. So who does this reviewing process for us? Well, I have an editorial board, and if you go to the TRSE website, you can see the folks that are on that editorial board. We have people from the United States and across the world. On 98% of manuscripts, there's at least one editorial board member who is a reviewer. Sometimes all 3 reviewers are editorial board members, but at least one is an editorial board member in most cases. So if they're not editorial board members, I send them out to folks in the field who are experts in the subject being written about. And then we give reviewers 5 to 6 weeks, and we like to think that they get all the reviews in within that 5 to 6 week time period, but it doesn't always happen. But rest assured, I'm kind of like the mafia. Kevin and Annalise can verify this. I come after you if the reviews are late, and so I get them in as fast as possible. And then at that point, I make a decision. Now, you might not like the decision that I make, but one thing that I can promise you is you will get a lot of feedback on your work if you submit to TRSE. If you've ever served as a reviewer for TRSE or submitted something to TRSE, you'll know that when you get a decision letter back from me or one of my associate editors, Paul Fitchett or Anthony Brown, you're going to get a written detailed letter that talks about the strengths and weaknesses of the manuscript and places that it could be improved. So if anything else, TRSE is a great way to get some good feedback on your work. So what makes a good TRSE manuscript? First off, does it follow our guidelines? Does it use APA? Is it blinded? You know, things like that, you know, sometimes will be the cause for me to desk reject it. And I might just say, I have to unsubmit this and you have to fix some things and you can resubmit it. You know, believe it or not, does it actually fall within the confines of social studies? Occasionally I'll get a manuscript that says something like, you know, best practices in mathematics education. And well, they obviously haven't read the journal. So does the manuscript follow TRSE guidelines? Does this represent sound research? Or if it's a theoretical piece, does it represent a sound argument? So this is largely an empirical journal. So if the methods aren't strong, that's not going to fare well in the external review process. Is the manuscript sufficiently theorized? Note that theory is in the name of the journal. You know, we give you that room to work with the 10,000 words because we want not just to see the findings, but we want you to theorize those findings within, you know, well-developed theoretical framework. And we'll come back to that here in a few minutes. Are the findings and discussion framed by relevant research? Is your paper fitting in with the conversation that's going on in the field within the various publications in social studies education, especially if you're talking about a topic that's been published about in TRSE? Are you citing those TRSE manuscripts? How does your research fit within what's going on with the field? Is it readable? You know, I know in these empirical journals, they're not practitioner pieces, and you know it's going to involve a little bit of heavy cognitive load there, but we want to make sure that people can actually read it and cite it and things like that. Now here's the one that this is where people get upset. You could have a well-written, solid, methodologically solid journal manuscript. You could have it could have a great theoretical framework. It could be well framed, but if it doesn't increase the field's understanding on a particular issue, what I like to call the so what question, it's not going to get published in TRSE. So, you know, to me, that's the hardest feedback to give to authors, is that nothing about your work was fundamentally flawed or bad. It's just that it doesn't move the field forward in new or significant directions as well as it needs to be in order to be published in the top journal in the field. And again, like I said, if anybody has questions as we're going, feel free to put them in the chat or ask. So there are 5 possible decisions that you could get on your manuscript when you submit. The first one is a desk reject. And again, that's the first line of defense, I guess, if you will. It comes to me and I basically say whether the topic is appropriate for the journal. And if it's not, then that's a desk reject. Or if there's a major outside. somebody's in like gale force wind or something. All right, but I think we fixed it. Um, so if there's a major like methodological flaw, okay, that I can see that I know the reviewers are going to pick up on, that might be a reason for a desk reject. Sometimes I will notice something that I think the reviewers will nail you on, but at the same time, I think it's fixable. So sometimes I'll desk reject, tell you to fix it, and then allow you to resubmit it as a new manuscript. Now, this one is like you have a better shot of getting struck by lightning than getting something that says accept as is on the first round of reviews. In my 6+ years of being an editor on TRSE, that's happened 0 times, absolutely 0. I'm not sure God could write a manuscript to get something accepted on the first go round with TRSE. That's not a bad thing. That just means that our reviewers, will find something that can make the manuscript improve. So even a good manuscript can be improved. So if you are submitting something and this is your goal to get something accepted without any revisions whatsoever on the first go round, you're going to be disappointed. So, we put this up here in the case that it may actually happen, but it's probably not going to. This still is very rare, okay? This is what you consider good news, really good news that you can walk around and be proud about this for the rest of the week. If you get an accept pending minor revisions on the first go round, that has happened since I've been editor maybe 6 times out of well over 1,000 manuscripts. So again, it's not going to happen. This should not be your definition of success on this, okay? If you do get this decision either on the first go round or even after a additional round of revisions, this is really good news because it means it's going to be accepted. It's going to be published. It's not going to be going back out for external review. You'll have to work with me a little bit. I might ask for some things before it goes to publication, but this decision always leads to acceptance. So when you're writing up your CV and you get this decision, the minute you see that word accept, you can go ahead and put on your CV that the article is in press. But again, I just want to reiterate, this is still very, very rare to get on the first round of reviews. The decision that you should really be rooting for or looking for on the first round of reviews is this: reject, encourage, resubmission. Other journals call this revise, resubmit. And the reason I really want to hammer this home is because sometimes, especially with newer scholars, they'll get this decision that says reject, encourage, resubmission. And all they can focus on is that word reject. And they get really upset and it's like, oh no, my work wasn't any good. If you remember nothing else from this webinar, remember that if you get a reject, encourage, resubmission from TRSE, that is good news. So a little bit of behind the scenes data crunching here. Of the manuscripts that get reject, encourage, resubmission, the acceptance rate on those manuscripts goes up to about 80% or higher. So as a general rule, you want to definitely resubmit when you get this decision. Publication's not guaranteed. Occasionally people will do what the reviewers ask and do what I ask, and it goes back out for another round of external reviews. And the reviewers just say, well, we gave them a shot, didn't work, and we have to reject it at that point. I don't like doing that. I'll explain that more in just a minute, but it does happen. It's also possible for me to ask you to revise the manuscript, resubmit it, go through another round of external review, and I say, it's better. I still see a pathway towards publication, but we're going to have to do this again, do this external review process again. So you might get another reject, encourage, resubmission. I definitely try not to make authors do more than 2 rounds of revision without either giving them an accept with revision decision or a straight up reject decision. And it's important because not all reject, encourage, resubmissions are created equal. So you want to read between the lines. Sometimes there are manuscripts where I really get a sense that the article is going to be, I feel very confident that the article, if they do what the reviewers ask, is going to be publishable. So I'll put in like bold and italicized things, and I'll say, I strongly encourage you to revise and resubmit the manuscript to TRSE. I'm really trying to get you to do that. Sometimes I'll say things like, well, if you have additional data, you could, get to this manuscript to the point where it could be publishable. But that's a little bit dicey on my part because I don't know if you have the data or not. So you kind of have to read between the lines about how good of a reject, encourage, resubmission it is, even though, again, any kind of decision you get before the editor, says reject flat out, that's a good decision. And some people always ask, when I get a manuscript, with a revise, resubmit, or reject, encourage, resubmission, will it go back to the same reviewers as the first time? I make every effort to try to do that. But the problem is I can't force people to review. So sometimes they are, they go on sabbatical, or, they're just too busy. But by and large, I always try to get at least one of the original reviewers to review the revised manuscript. All right, so this is the decision that no one likes to see, but keeping in mind with a 10% acceptance rate, this is the one that most people are going to get, unfortunately. This is just a flat out reject. Again, the thing to remember with this is your manuscript was good enough to be sent out for external review. So that's something that you can take away from this process. And no matter, even if you get a reject decision, you're going to get good feedback from TRSE. But then again, nobody likes to get rejected. But it's, everybody, Annalise and Kevin will be the first ones to tell you, everybody gets rejected. I've been rejected many, many, many times. So the point here is, it's not, your work isn't necessarily bad. It may just not be a great fit for the journal, or it just doesn't meet that threshold of what it takes to get into TRSE. But again, you're still going to get good feedback. And usually I try to do a pretty good job of giving you places where you could submit your revised manuscript to a different outlet where you'd have better success. So a few final thoughts here on the decision process. It becomes really frustrating because of the 3 reviewers, they often disagree. Being an editor would be really easy if all the reviewers agreed every time. All 3 of them say accept with revisions, or all 3 say reject. But that doesn't happen too often. Okay. One of the, I would say at least over 90%, the reviews come back something like, one reviewer will say accept with revisions, one reviewer will say reject, encourage, resubmission, and one reviewer will say reject. So then the ball gets put in my court, and I have to be the kind of the tiebreaker there. And sometimes the reviewers disagree in their qualitative feedback. Some reviewers will say, I like this theoretical framework. And then the other reviewer 2 will say, no, I don't think this theoretical framework works. I try something different. And in those cases, when you really want to hone in on my editorial decision letter, because I'll say, I respect reviewer 1, but I would go with reviewer 2 and change your theoretical framework to whatever it may be. And then the other thing to remember is you don't know who the reviewers are, but I do. And so not all the reviewers are created equal. If I'm sending something out on history education, and reviewer 2 is the preeminent, scholar in this aspect of, say, historical empathy, and they say accept with revisions, or they say reject, I'm going to kind of, key in on their feedback a little bit stronger than maybe reviewer 1 or reviewer 3. So that's just something to keep in mind. Don't try to argue with the editors, and that's just not, I'm not saying that just for me, but even with other journals, when the editor comes out and says it's going to be a reject, I say, Eric asked a good question. Does a reject, encourage, resubmission count as a reject for the purposes of calculating the acceptance rate? Yes. Yes. So a reject, encourage, resubmission, that does count as a reject. That's a good question. That's another reason why you shouldn't be as scared of that 10% acceptance rate statistic. And so this one is going to be specific to TRSE because other editors have different philosophies on this. My editorial philosophy is that I think it's more humane to outright reject a manuscript rather than give a reject, encourage, resubmission, unless I strongly feel that the manuscript has a clear pathway to being accepted. Because again, I'm thinking of people who are on the tenure track. You know, tenure track is really 5 years. You send out the external letters to your for your dossier at the end of that 5th year. And so if you waste, you know, a year with a journal doing a revised resubmits and then it ultimately gets rejected, that's kind of time you can't get back. So when I give a reject, encourage, resubmission decision, I'm saying I do see a pathway to publication. Again, it doesn't always work out that way. I really hate rejecting something after authors have spent time revising it. But it does happen. But again, so if you submit something to TRSE and you get a reject, encourage, resubmission decision, that is good news. That means I think you have a strong chance of getting it published. So definitely do the reject, encourage, resubmission. Here recently, we've had some authors who've gotten reject, encourage, resubmission, and I think probably it's due to the fact that they've been busy with the pandemic and they haven't resubmitted, which really just breaks my heart because, you know, it's like, oh, I think their manuscript could get published. But so always do the revision if given the opportunity. And again, even if you get a reject decision, you shouldn't consider the process of submitting the TRSE a waste of time, because the one thing that I can promise you is that you are going to get good feedback, both from the reviewers. I send, you know, stuff out to great reviewers. Our editorial board in particular provide great reviews, and I try to do my best to synthesize those reviews and really write a thoughtful decision letter for you. So now let's get to the part where I think most people want to get some inside information here. So ways to improve your odds of getting things published in TRSE. All right, the first thing is, this is going to sound a little silly, but if you're not a regular reader of the journal, start reading. You know, I'm really focusing this on the doc students who are in the audience, because I know you've got a lot of reading in your classes. But the reading in your classes should be the baseline of what you're reading. If you want to publish in a journal, you need to make sure that you are understanding the conversation that's going on in the journal. Understanding that, you know, does this journal publish the type of methods that I use and things like that? Is it publishing on the topics? You know, because again, if you're publishing, say, on an issue related to race and social studies, well, we publish a lot on race and social studies in TRSE. So you want to make sure that your manuscript really speaks to those other articles that have already been published. Also, and again, I'm thinking of early career scholars who have just completed their dissertation. You know, when you write chapter 3 of your dissertation, which is the one on the methods, you have to really flesh out your methods, right? You know, you're doing a case study and you got to talk about all this stuff with case study. But at the same time, when you start reading TRSE and other journals, you'll see how certain things are written, that you don't have to get that detailed on certain aspects of methodology. Like, for example, case studies are well known at this point within the social studies educational literature. So you don't really have to write that much. You know, you have to cite Stake or cite Yen or Merriam, and then kind of move on with your life. Now, if you are doing something that is out of the norm of social studies in terms of methodology, you're going to want to explain that in greater detail. But you want to kind of get a sense of how people talk about things with methodology. It allows you to cut some corners there. Again, theory is in the name of the journal. Make sure your manuscript has a distinct theoretical framework. And so this theoretical framework should be the lens through which you plan the study and which you analyze the data, okay? And so a lot of times, this goes into the next one, make sure you actually use that theoretical framework. Too often I see author goes and writes a great, wonderful theoretical framework, and it's just, you know, they write about critical race theory or whatever the case may be, and it just sits there, right? And they never come back to it. In theory, your theoretical framework we should be able to see clearly how it influenced the methods of how the study was created. We should really definitely see how the theoretical framework influenced the data analysis. And then especially when you get to the discussion section, bring that theoretical framework as well as parts of your literature review back so you can help make a case for how your study moves the field in new or significant directions. And I've got a little sub hint here. Don't try to analyze your findings in the findings section, right? So the findings section, a lot of times I see people trying to present their findings and analyze it at the same time. You can do a little bit of that, you know, you can get away with it, but really in your findings section, present the findings and then use your discussion section to really analyze it. We'll come back to that in a second, which is right now. This is probably the #1 thing that I see people, especially newer scholars, is where I think their manuscript falls short a lot of times. That discussion section, you've got this great manuscript that leads up to the discussion section, and then the discussion section is almost like you run out of gas. It shouldn't be just a recap of your findings. Keep in mind that the readers have just spent 15, 20 pages reading your findings. It's fine to recap it in a paragraph or so, but you want to spend this time in the discussion section answering what I call here the so what question. And Annalise and Kevin can attest to this. In my discussion, in my decision letters, I always say, give me the so what. Tell me why this matters, right? You know, why do your findings, you know, how do your findings move the field in new directions or significant directions? How does it build on previous literature? What are the implications for K-12 schooling or teacher education? What are the limitations here? You know, nothing is ever a perfect study. So there's always going to be limitations to whatever comes out of the study, but that also tends to be an opportunity for you can say, this is where future research is needed. It could be future research that I plan on doing myself, or you can call on other scholars or the field as a whole to, you know, address this issue that you've been studying. Okay. And with TRSE in particular, all right, it is an empirical journal. Don't skimp on your methods. Make sure you explain your methods in great detail. Okay, and you'll notice if you read TRSE that our methodology sections tend to be longer than in most journals. Where reviewers really ding authors is in your data analysis. A lot of times authors talk about their data analysis in very vague terms, like we did coding and then the coding led to a pattern and this is how I got my data, right? Well, give us some examples of your coding. Give us some examples of the patterns that emerge. You really want the reviewers to be able to see the analysis that occurred, especially if you're writing with other people. How did that coding process work? You know, did you have inter-rater reliability? You know, what happened when you disagreed? You know, be able to explain those type of things with your data analysis. If you are given a reject, encourage, resubmission decision, I mentioned this in the bottom of my decision letter, but one thing that you always want to do, not just for TRSE, but for any journal that you submit to when you get a revise, resubmit, or a reject, encourage, resubmission decision, is you want to write a blinded cover letter. Now, when I say blinded, you can't have your affiliation on it, you can't have your name on it. And the reason is, this letter is going to be shared with the reviewers. So in this letter, you want to talk about how you internalize the reviewer's comments and how you internalize the editor's comments and explain how you address their concerns. That does not necessarily mean that you have to agree with everything that I say or the reviewers say. It's perfectly fine to disagree with reviewers or the editor, but you need to explain why. You know, a lot of times I'll be like, okay, I get it, that's fine. And it's not a problem. But if you don't explain why, the reviewers will think that you just disregarded their comment, which tends to make them angry. And you don't want angry reviewers when they're getting ready to review the manuscript that you just resubmitted. And then this last one is going to be, Annalise, what? Does it matter how often you disagree with the reviewers or editors? I would say no, as long as you have good reasons for doing so. You know, I think a lot of times when the author disagrees with the reviewer or the editors, it was largely due to the fact that they didn't explain things well enough the first time around. And so maybe, they explain things a little bit better this time around, and they have justification for disagreeing. So I would say it doesn't matter how often, as long as they're not being dismissive of the reviewers or editors' feedback, as long as they can show that they internalized it and can explain. Read two, are editors open to discussing the letter further before resubmission? Sure, yeah. So when I send out a decision letter, the last thing that is on the letter before my signature is an invitation that I'm happy to help you in any way as you revise this manuscript. So there's nothing wrong with sending me an email and saying, hey, can you point me in the right direction here? I'm always happy to help authors out that way. Let me see, is there another comment here? Okay. Oh, is Kevin, are you answering somebody's question, or are you just making a comment? Okay, cool.
Yeah, just sharing, Wayne, based on your discussion of the so what emphasis, just a couple of extra points.
Yeah. All right, perfect. Any other questions before we go to the next one? All right, the next to last way to improve your odds. I know this sounds like, a little bit kindergartnerish, but the writing matters, okay? Everybody is prone to the occasional typo or the occasional grammatical mistake. But if you have a lot of them, it's going to make me and it's going to make the reviewers skeptical about other aspects of your work. It takes away from that quality of your work. And then, I have one of the, I don't know if it's a benefit, but one of the ramifications of being an editor is I know APA inside and out way more than any of you probably ever want to know about APA. So I've gotten to the point where, if I see APA mistakes, they just like pop out of the paper for me. So make sure you're at least doing making the effort, or at least making it pretend like you're doing the effort, or get your doc students to do it for you, to get the manuscript compliant with APA as best you can. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with having other people read your manuscripts before you submit them. Like I said, TRSE is an international journal. We get a lot of manuscripts from places outside the United States, including scholars whose English is not their first language, which to me is always just amazing. Like I tip my hat to anybody that can write a scholarly manuscript in a manuscript that's not their native tongue. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with having somebody else, whether it's a native English speaker or even somebody that just wants to give you critical feedback on your manuscript before you submit them. The more eyes you can get on the manuscript before it gets sent to the journal, it's going to produce a cleaner manuscript, and they're going to, it's going to improve the quality of the submission. Eric, I'm going to come to that question here in just a minute. So the last way, and this gets to Eric's question here, the last way you can improve your odds is to become a TRSE reviewer, okay? Now, I'm not just saying this to increase my pool of reviewers, which is always nice though, but being a reviewer does allow you to see the process from the inside, okay? So if you've never reviewed something for a scholarly journal before, reach out to the editors, and you can reach out to me, or you can reach out to editors of different journals and ask to be considered to review manuscripts in the future. And there's a reason for that. One, it helps with that imposter syndrome thing, right? So you see something that, yeah, Kevin, it's on the next slide. And so, everybody has that imposter syndrome, especially when you're first starting out, as you're a doc student or you're an early career faculty member. It's like my work's definitely not as good as the stuff that you see published. The thing to remember is the things that you see in the journal that have been published, they've already gone through all this process of revise, resubmit. The stuff that they submitted initially isn't that polished thing that you see in the print pages of the journal. So when you review something, you can kind of see the manuscript when it's still rough, and it allows you to go, oh, I can hang with this, right? My work can, is on par with this. But then going to Eric's question that he asked a couple minutes ago on the chat, another benefit of being a TRSE reviewer, and I think a lot of journals are moving this way, is when you are a reviewer, after the decision is made, you get a blinded copy of my editorial decision letter, as well as copies of the other reviewers' comments. So you can kind of get a sense of how your review stacks up with the other people's reviewers, the other reviewers' comments, as well as seeing how I internalize your comments along with the other reviewers' comments. To me, that is extremely educational, especially for new scholars. Pat Avery actually started doing that back when she was towards the end of her term as TRSE editor. And at that time, I was, an assistant professor, and I was, being asked to do reviews. And, that was one of the things that really improved my own writing as much as anything, is seeing how other reviewers commented on manuscripts. And so, again, by seeing what's accepted and what isn't into the journal, you can get a better idea of what constitutes a good TRSE manuscript. Now, especially for the doc students here, this goes to Kevin's comment in the chat. We've had a program since 2017, which, based on all the qualitative feedback we've gotten from it, has been extremely successful. It's just an idea that I randomly had, but I'm glad I had it because, I think it's really helped kind of mentor, especially doc students. So if you're a doc student on this, feel free after the webinar is over, send me an email if you're interested in being a part of this program. The way it works is doc students serve as a fourth reviewer. So normally, we send things out to 3 reviewers. The doc students serve as an extra reviewer. It's a completely no pressure situation because I don't consider the doc student reviewers' comments when I make my decision letter. Okay. The author will, however, see your comments. So you want to give it your best shot about giving it a good review. And we'll talk about what makes a good review here in just a second. But again, to me, the main benefit of coming into this program is after the decision's made, you get that blinded email with the other reviewers' comments, as well as the blinded decision letter that I wrote. So you can get a really behind the scenes look at the publishing publishing process. One thing that we've added to this program in, I think, the last couple of years is, and if you remember from the beginning of the presentation, about 98% of all manuscripts have a editorial board member as a reviewer. So if a doc student reviewer is on the manuscript afterwards, I hook them up with one or more of the editorial board members that also served as reviewers on the manuscript, and I give them the opportunity to talk to each other, and they can kind of serve as a mentor for talking through and processing the reviewing process. So again, I haven't heard from everybody that's participated in this program, but it's everybody. When I send out surveys to people who've done it, all the feedback has been extremely positive. So again, if you're interested, all you got to do is send me an email with your institution and your research interest. So I see a question from Kelly. If you signed up for the Doc Student Review Program before, can you sign up for it again this year? By all means. So send me an email and just let me know. In those cases, what I'll do is I'll make sure that the new people get to go first, but then I'll start again to the folks who have done it before. And again, there's also a tangible benefit for the doc students here besides just the process. You can put on your CV that you are a TRSE reviewer, and when you're going out on the job market, all that stuff, all those extra lines on your vita matter. Okay, let me see. I asked a question. Should we submit the whole 10,000 word manuscript, or is there a way to submit an abstract to ensure that our article fits the journal? Great question. Great question. So you can send me an email with the abstract. But I hate to say this, but I'm not sure it's going to be all that helpful, because people do this all the time. They send me abstracts, and sometimes I can quickly tell them, no, this is clearly not a good fit. But usually what I say is I can't make a clear decision based on just an abstract. So the way that I would, answer that question is, we have such a fast review process. I mean, when I desk reject something, I will desk reject something in no more than 3 days. So, you know, if you have the manuscript written, just submit it. And if it's not a good fit, I'll let you know quickly. You won't have to waste time on that. So, but I mean, if it makes you feel better and you want to send me an email, I'll be happy to write back to you and say, maybe, yeah, but you're probably going to have to submit the whole manuscript. But great question, though. So, what makes a good review? And this is where Kevin and Annalise can really jump in if they want. So, when you go into Manuscript Central and submit a review, you'll see two boxes. The first box says to the editor, and the second box says to the author. You don't have to put anything in the to the editor box, but you have to put something in the to the author box. In that box that's just going to be seen by me, you can be as honest and upfront as you want. If you say that this manuscript sucks and should never ever be published anywhere in the world, that's perfectly fine. But don't say that in the one that goes to the author. Okay. One of the things that I like to pride ourselves on as a field, at least for the editorial board members that I have on, at my disposal, as well as the vast majority of the other reviewers that I get from the field, we have really nice reviewers. Now they're not afraid to reject something, but they're going to give constructive, kind feedback. Now, does that mean you're not ever going to get just a jackass reviewer? It happens. Sometimes I will test out a new reviewer and they get feedback that's just mean, right? Typically, when I get somebody that's just mean, I don't use them again. So I try to make sure that reviewers give good feedback and they give constructive feedback to authors, but in a polite way. I see a question here from Johan. In regard to grammar and typos, are there any typical advice for Europeans that have mother tongues other than English? Get somebody who speaks English as their mother tongue to take a look at it. Also, Taylor and Francis and other publishing houses, they offer services. Now, I think you do have to pay a little bit. I'm not sure. I really don't know the price. I wish I could tell you offhand. I don't think it's terrible, but they will look it over and make sure that they've corrected some of the grammar and typos. So what constitutes a good review? First thing, from an editor's perspective, it's completed on time. Okay, so I can't write my decision letter until the reviews are in. The reason I am sending a manuscript out to the reviewers is because I want their expertise. And, believe it or not, I'm pretty stupid on most things other than the things that I know a decent amount about, right? So if it's on controversial issues or civic education, I'm good to go. But when I get manuscripts on other things, I'm relying on those reviewers to really, help me out about, whether the manuscript is good or not. So I want to know from you and your expertise. Again, this kind of goes back to being constructive and polite. You want to discuss positive and negative aspects of the manuscript, right? Don't just focus on the negative. Talk about what's good. Every manuscript has good qualities. Every manuscript has places that they can improve. But again, the more specific you can be, the better. Don't just tell an author, that their theoretical framework doesn't work. Okay, why doesn't it work? What would be potentially a better theoretical framework? Give suggestions. And again, you want to be collegial here. You don't want to be mean-spirited. And again, offer suggestions on how you might remedy certain limitations, if there is a possibility of remedying things. It's really helpful to me as an editor if you touch on all sections of the manuscript. So that way, because when I write down, and this goes to Annalise's question that she just posed. From my perspective, as long as the review is encompassing, I don't care whether it's holistic or section by section. But if I had to pick one, I love section by section reviews, because if you've ever gotten a decision letter from TRSE, that's usually how I outline the decision letter. I go, straight down the manuscript and talk about the different sections of the manuscript. So, I'm fine either way you do it, as long as it's comprehensive and constructive. But, in a perfect world, I love the reviews to go down section by section. And then this is the one that that's hard for a lot of reviewers, because we are a nice field. We don't like to be mean and reject things. And, you know, it does frustrate me a little bit as an editor when a reviewer will, you know, spend 10 paragraphs talking about how much a manuscript, you know, falls short, but then recommend accept with revision. And so, you know, it ends up making me the bad guy, which is fine. That's why I make the big bucks, right? But you know, it's always, but I think the problem is it causes a little bit of cognitive dissonance for the authors. So when you write up a review, just be realistic. Look that review over. Does that follow the, you know, the rubric of, you know, an accept with revisions? Because accept with revisions means just very minor things need to be fixed. Or is it more of a reject, encourage resubmission, where they're gonna have to do almost a complete rewrite of the piece? Or when you look at it, is this too much to ask for an author to do a revision? If that's the case, then the you know, decision probably needs to be a reject. So, you know, I engage more with the comments that reviewers make rather than their publication recommendations. But it is nice for the author to not get confused in terms of the publication recommendations that reviewers make. Annalise and Kevin, did you want to add anything here, since they do a lot of reviews for me?
Sure, I can just mention really quickly that sort of unsurprisingly, there's a relationship, I think, between the editorial culture that Wayne and colleagues cultivate and the kinds of reviews that authors get. You know, being a top tier publication, TRSE gets a lot of manuscripts. And similar to other top tier publications, it's the one that I've seen that is really extensive and thorough and formative in the way that authors receive feedback. I mean, Wayne's editorial letters are multiple pages in length, single spaced, that integrate the comments from all of the reviewers in the recommendations and the feedback and the indications of what's good and what could be improved upon. And I think one of the things that's just important to acknowledge that should feel good for people who are submitting manuscripts to TRSE is an editorial culture that has been painstakingly cultivated during Wayne's time as journal editor. And it's something that has paid a lot of dividends, both as an author who's published in TRSE, as well as a reviewer who learns a lot from the feedback that other reviewers give and that Wayne gives as an editor. And as authors, you know, you should take some comfort in the fact that, you know, should your manuscript make it to reject and pass desk reject, you'll get that kind of feedback because of the editorial culture that, you know, that we've sort of cultivated, that Wayne has cultivated. I think that's just really important to acknowledge.
Well, and thanks, Kevin. And I just want to say it happened before me. One of my academic heroes is Pat Avery, and she was the editor of TRSE when I was a doc student, and through most of the time I was an assistant professor, and she did these types of editorial decision letters too. And I remember benefiting from her mentorship. I had never even met Pat Avery for the first 3 or 4 years of my professional career. But I always tell people she probably influenced me more than anybody outside of maybe my dissertation advisor. So, you know, when I became editor, I wanted to do the same thing that Pat Avery did for me. But so I'm glad to hear from Kevin that he thinks that it's still continuing. Annalise, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just like to echo that. Yeah, Wayne, you're a fantastic editor, and Pat, I've worked with her before too. She was really incredible and very supportive. I think that's really a hallmark of TRSE. One thing with a good review, you know, Wayne, you spoke to the point about, you know, it's impossible to know all the scholarship in the field, and so in the reviews, it's really helpful if you can point to literature that you think the author should have considered, you know, because, you know, Wayne as editor is not going to know all that scholarship. So if there's like a really good dissertation you read that needs to be cited, or something in a practitioner journal that maybe, you know, just didn't come up, that the author didn't come across when they were doing a lit review, you know, it's really helpful. And I love, as an author, getting feedback with like, oh, you should read this, this, and this, you know, and it really can be formative in revising your manuscript. So I would just say that's one thing to think about when you do review. What's other scholarship the author should be reading?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, I always like to say that reviewers make me look a lot smarter than I am. So when the reviewers, really unpack a piece and give those, other places that authors should look, it really helps me write those decision letters. And again, it makes me look a lot, sharper than I really am. And that really kind of takes us to the end here. And I'll stop sharing my screen. You can see my email here. And we've got a few minutes left if people want to ask some questions. I'm happy to, and we can even extend a little bit if we have multiple questions. Anybody? If not, we can wrap it up. Sure. I'll put it.
Wayne, can you maybe just say what's super hot in the field right now? Like, what are some things that you're excited about getting manuscripts, the topics?
Okay, so I think that's actually a double-edged question there. So some things that are hot in the field, race and social studies is something that we're publishing a lot. Anything to do with like critical approaches to social studies is something we're publishing a lot. Controversial issues, especially now with the current polarization and things with critical race theory and whatnot, that's always going to be a hot topic. That's a lot of things with like difficult histories. That's another hot topic right now in the field. To answer Annalise's second question of what I would like to see, I'd like to see more manuscripts about all of those things that I just mentioned. But throughout our history with TRSE and the field of social studies education, there have been things that have been marginalized within our literature. We get a lot of manuscripts on history. We get a lot of manuscripts on civics. I'd love to see more manuscripts that take critical looks at economics or geography. I'd like to see more manuscripts that talk about how to teach social studies with with students with special needs or English language learners. So there's a lot of places in the field. If you kind of want to get a sense of that, if you go back to 2017 in the journal, you go back on the TRSE website, you'll see my call, my initial call for manuscripts or editorial vision article there. So there's definitely places where the field has been growing, which has been great, but there's also places where the field I think should grow a little bit farther. Any other questions? Johan, can you say more about the use of theory, used as an operational tool versus a framework to discuss your results again? Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think it has to be either or. The main thing is that if you're going to have a theoretical framework, it needs to do something in the manuscript. That's the main thing that I really want to impart there. Again, the way I think about a theoretical framework is that it's the lens that you use to both, formulate the study and carry it out, but also really analyzing those results. That's the thing that I really think should be a take home from the theoretical framework aspect of it. And again, if you're talking to other colleagues, a couple of things to really take home here is what Kevin said earlier about how I try to make the journal more than just publications. It should be an educational thing for the field. That's why I have the Doctor Student Reviewer program. But also, we work hard to make sure that authors get decisions in a timely manner. So I always tell authors, you might not be happy with the decision you get, but you're going to get it quickly and you're going to get good feedback on it. Any other questions? I got one. Well, I've got right at 4 o'clock, so I'm happy to answer questions as long as people have questions, but if not, we can call it a day.
Wayne, could you put your email back in the chat? I didn't catch it on the slide.
Yep, there you go. There you go.
Thank you so much, Wayne. I think a bunch of us have to head out, but thank you all for coming, and thank you, Wayne, for hosting this webinar. It was very informative.
All right, thanks for having me.
Have a good week, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
See ya.